Have you ever witnessed a UFO? Hearing this question, you might think I'm joking. UFOs aren't that easy to spot. If that's what you think, you might be wrong. In fact, on average, there are thousands of UFO sightings reported worldwide each year. According to data visualized by Statista and reported by Dig, the number of global UFO sightings saw a significant increase in recent years, with 5,035 sightings reported in 2022 alone. Additionally, the National UFO Reporting Center, NUFORC, regularly updates its database with new reports, indicating a steady stream of sightings every month. Since its inception, NUFORC has compiled over 100,000 reports from across the globe, with notable increases during specific periods of heightened public interest or significant events. Today, here are some stories related to UFOs for you guys. And welcome to Chilling Tale Hub. It's good to see you made it back for another episode. The story in this video comes from viewers just like you or from the web. For the sake of preserving our loved ones' identities and privacy, some stories have altered locations and used alias. Just a heads up, if you have a story that you would like to share in my future video, whether it's about cryptid encounters, chilling experiences, or anything else, be sure to submit your story via the email you can find in the description down below. I'd love to share your story with everyone here, and stories like yours that help keep this show going. Now let's get into these chilling encounter horror stories. It was around 11 p.m. on July 14th, 2005, a date that has since been burned into my memory. I was winding down for the night, preparing for bed, but there was one last task I needed to complete: walking my dog Luna. Luna, a spirited golden retriever, was always eager for her evening walk, and this night was no exception. She bounded around excitedly as I grabbed her leash, her tail wagging furiously. The night was typical for early June in our little town of Hillsdale, nestled in the rolling hills of rural Pennsylvania. The air was cool but comfortable, and the sky was clear, stars sparkling brightly above. The street was quiet, with most of the neighbors already tucked in for the night. Luna and I started our usual route down the street, heading towards the small park at the end of the block. As we approached the park, the sky began to cloud over, and I felt the first few drops of rain. Both Luna and I love the rain, so instead of turning back as we usually did, I decided to extend our walk. We continued down the road, the sound of raindrops tapping on the pavement creating a soothing rhythm. The rain began to fall more steadily, but it only added to the tranquility of the night. We reached Highland Park, a small, serene spot with a few picnic tables and a playground. The park was empty, save for the occasional chirp of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. Luna and I sat at a picnic table, enjoying the rain and the peacefulness of the night. The park's trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves rustling softly. It was then that I began to feel an inexplicable sense of unease. It started as a faint tingle at the back of my neck, a primal instinct warning me of danger. The feeling grew stronger, morphing into a heavy sense of dread. I felt as though there were eyes on me, watching from the shadows of the woods that bordered the park. I glanced around nervously, my heart beginning to race, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Trying to shake off the fear, I decided it was time to leave. I called Luna, and we started to head back, but the feeling of being watched persisted. The fear grew too intense to ignore, and I found myself quickening my pace, Luna trotting along beside me, seemingly oblivious to my anxiety. As we approached the lagoon, a retired sewage pond that had been drained and left to nature, the sense of being stalked became overwhelming. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, and every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sent a jolt of terror through me. I was certain that something, or someone, was following us. Desperation took over, and I broke into a run, pulling Luna along with me. I ran as fast as I could, my breath coming in ragged gasps until I could no longer maintain the pace. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, I turned around to see if anything was behind us. My eyes scanned the darkness, but I saw nothing. Just as I was starting to feel a small sense of relief, I looked up and froze. Hovering above me were two triangular-shaped objects, like nothing I had ever seen before. They were a dark, hazy gray with faintly glowing red domes on their undersides. Each corner of the triangles had a bright white light, and the objects seemed to be circling each other in a synchronized dance. I stood there, rooted to the spot, staring up at these flying machines. Despite the fear coursing through me, there was something mesmerizing about their movements. They were eerily silent, gliding through the air with a grace that defied explanation. I watched them for what felt like an eternity, though it was likely only a few minutes. Luna, sensing my stillness, sat down beside me, her head tilted as if she too were curious about the strange sight above. Suddenly, one of the objects stopped circling and hovered directly above me. Before I could react, a blinding white light enveloped me, so intense that I instinctively closed my eyes and shielded my face. Panic surged through me, but then, inexplicably, a wave of calm washed over me. My fear dissipated, replaced by an almost unnatural tranquility. When I opened my eyes, the light was gone, and so were the flying machines. I stood there in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. Luna nudged my leg, bringing me back to reality. I looked around, expecting to see something, anything, that could explain the bizarre encounter, but there was nothing. The park was as quiet and empty as it had been when we arrived. Shaken, I decided it was time to head home. I glanced at my watch and froze. It was 3:17 a.m. I had left the house a little after 10 p.m., and what I thought had been a 45-minute walk had somehow stretched into nearly 5 hours. Confused and more than a little frightened, I hurried home, Luna trotting beside me. When I finally got back, I collapsed onto my bed, trying to make sense of the night's events. I replayed everything in my mind. The strange sense of fear, the hovering objects, the blinding light, but none of it added up. Exhausted, I eventually fell into a restless sleep, haunted by the inexplicable memories. The next day at work, I found it hard to concentrate. My mind kept drifting back to the night before, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something extraordinary had happened. As the day went on, I began to experience strange flashes of memory. They were disjointed and confusing, like scenes from a dream. I saw myself standing on a platform in an all-white room, surrounded by tall, blonde people who seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. They were nude, but their presence was anything but sexual. Instead, they exuded an aura of serene detachment. In these memory flashes, I tried to communicate with them, but they appeared to be afraid of me. Their expressions were a mix of curiosity and fear, and I couldn't understand why. One of them, whose hand glowed with a soft blue light, reached out and slapped me across the face. The sensation was jarring, and when I touched my cheek, I could still feel the sting. The red mark and slight bruise that had appeared overnight seemed to corroborate the memory. Over the next few days, the memory flashes continued. Each one added a new piece to the puzzle, but the picture they formed was still incomplete and bewildering. I began to suspect that I had experienced what some people refer to as a lost time scenario, a period of missing time often associated with alien abductions. The idea was both terrifying and fascinating. I spent hours online, researching similar experiences and trying to find answers. I read about Nordic aliens, also known as Pleiadians, tall, blonde extraterrestrials who were said to be benevolent but distant. The descriptions matched the beings in my memories, and it made me wonder if that's what I had encountered. But why would they abduct me? And why would one of them slap me? The questions gnawed at me, and the lack of concrete answers only added to my frustration. One question that haunted me was what had happened to Luna during the abduction. Had she been taken with me? Or had she been left behind, placed in some sort of suspended state? Luna seemed fine, her usual cheerful self, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she had experienced something too. It all started on a Friday night. I had worked a double shift at the store because we were shorthanded. As a cashier at our neighborhood Kroger store, double shifts weren't new to me, but they were always exhausting. 2 people had called in sick, and I needed the extra money, so I volunteered to stay late and help close. By the time I finally arrived at my apartment, it was well past midnight. The building was eerily quiet, and the darkness was only broken by the faint glow of the streetlights outside. Usually, the lights in my apartment are on when I come home because my roommate, Jenny, has a habit of leaving them on. But that night, the apartment was pitch black. I fumbled for my keys in my purse, remembering that Jenny had mentioned she had tickets for a concert and wouldn't be home until after midnight. I wasn't too concerned. After all, I was used to having the place to myself occasionally. As I finally managed to unlock the door and step inside, I immediately noticed the unusual silence. Normally, Athena, my 2-year-old Labrador, would come bounding up to greet me, her tail wagging furiously. But tonight, there was no sign of her. I called out her name a few times, my voice echoing in the quiet apartment. Still, there was no response. A sense of unease began to creep over me as I turned on a few lights and started to search for her. I found Athena hiding under my bed, her body curled up tightly and her eyes wide with fear. She refused to come out, no matter how much I coaxed her. Deciding that she would come out when she was ready, I left her there and went to take a shower before bed. As I stood under the warm water, I pondered what could be wrong with her. Maybe she was sick or had heard something that scared her. Athena was usually so brave. It was unlike her to act this way. Just as I was finishing up my shower, I thought I heard a low growl coming from Athena. My heart skipped a beat. The combination of being alone in the house and hearing that growl made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I love scary movies and probably watched too many of them, so I knew how vulnerable I was in the shower. Trying to shake off the fear, I dried off quickly and threw on my pajamas. When I stepped back into the bedroom, Athena's tail was still sticking out from under the bed. I got down on my hands and knees to peek under and talk to her, but she was deathly still. Worried, I gently pulled her out. She seemed to be sleeping but didn't wake up when I moved her. Before I could think too much about it, the room was suddenly flooded with a blindingly bright light. I heard a loud thump, and then everything went black. What happened next felt like the strangest dream. I saw dark shadows standing in front of the bright light, and I felt several pairs of cold hands on me, pinning me to the floor. I couldn't move, but I also couldn't feel any emotion. It was as if I was detached from my own body. I felt a warm liquid being poured over me, starting at the top of my head and slowly making its way down to my feet. As it reached my feet, I drifted off into a peaceful nothingness. The next thing I remember is waking up to Athena licking my face. It was daylight outside, and the sun was shining through my bedroom window. I thought I had just had the weirdest dream. The first thing I did was get online and start researching the meaning of my dream. I didn't find much, and as the day progressed, I slowly forgot about the dream. I only worked a few hours that afternoon, so I got home early. Athena was lying in the front room when I got home. She seemed to be exhausted. My roommate had left me a note on the table about some amazing guy she had met the night before and said she might be late again. I wasn't used to having the house to myself, so I was a little excited. I could eat junk food and watch whatever I wanted on TV all evening. I was off on Sunday, so I could stay up late and sleep in. As evening rolled around and it started to get dark, Athena got up long enough to eat and then lay down beside me on the couch as I got ready to start my first movie. About an hour in, Athena started to act weird. She jumped off the couch and began to whine, pacing from the couch to the front door and back. I thought she needed to go to the bathroom, but normally she would just use the doggy door in the back of the house. I got up and walked her to the back door as she begrudgingly followed me. As I opened the door, I was hit in the face by a light so bright that it momentarily blinded me. Athena yelped and took off back through the house, looking for a place to hide. As I looked back to see where the light was coming from, I had the strange feeling that the floor had disappeared from beneath my feet. It was a terrifying feeling, and I was just waiting for my body to crash into the floor. For the second time, everything just faded away, and I seemed to fall into a peaceful sleep. Again, the next morning, I woke up curled up under the blankets on my bed. I did not remember nearly as much as I had the day before. I was starting to get worried that there was something wrong with me. I don't drink, and I've never had any health problems. I couldn't find any bumps or bruises, so what the heck was going on? Was I going crazy? Later that day, I told Jenny what had happened, and she listened patiently, but I could tell she didn't believe me. She suggested that if it kept happening, I should see a doctor. The next 3 nights, I made it to bed peacefully without any strange happenings. But each night I had similar dreams to the first night. Each dream had a little more detail than the last. I was lying on a cold metallic surface in a room that looked like it was completely made of metal. The room was large but fairly empty. There was a huge bright light directly overhead. As I was lifted onto the bed, I eventually started to make out shapes with faces. They had large heads and dark eyes, but I never saw past that. By the 5th encounter, I was starting to feel sleep-deprived. I decided on Wednesday evening that I would stay up all night. I thought if I deprived myself of enough sleep, I would quit dreaming and be able to sleep through the next night. I seriously failed at that. I passed out on the couch around midnight. I didn't have any dreams or anything strange happen that I recall until I woke up. I woke up in my bed with no idea how I got there. Later that day, I noticed that I had a rash on both of my wrists, and shortly after, I noticed the same thing on my ankles. It didn't itch. It was just a splotch of bright red spots that went all the way around. At this point, you can guess where my imagination was going. Thursday evening rolled around, and I still had not called a doctor or talked to anyone else. I just figured that whatever was going on would run its course and I would be fine. It wasn't really late when I decided that I would go to bed early since I had to work the next day. I brushed my teeth, put on my pajamas, and convinced Athena to sleep with me, hoping that her presence would help me feel safe. I had trouble falling asleep, and around 10 p.m., it started to rain outside. The rain was soothing, and I finally dozed off, only to be scared right out of my sleep by a crash outside my bedroom window. I was scared, but I still managed to get out of bed to take a look out the window. A large tree branch had fallen out of a tree close to my room. I didn't recall any lightning, but I must have missed it while I was sleeping. I went back to bed, relieved that the only thing scary outside was nature, but it wasn't what was outside that I should have been scared of. This was the worst night of all. I drifted off into what started out as a peaceful sleep. Slowly, I started to become aware of my surroundings. There I was in the same room, and the creatures were standing all around me. They were trying to fasten me down to a hard surface. They were communicating with each other in a weird, chirping sound. I fought hard and eventually broke loose and fell onto the floor. I somehow made it to my feet and ran through the only doorway in that room. As I was running, everything started to get very bright. Then the light faded, and I was standing in the front yard. Next to me stood Athena. I called my mom, and she called a doctor. They examined me and ran tests. I even talked to a shrink, but they gave me a clean bill of health. I didn't stay with Jenny one more day after that. I moved back home with my mom. I haven't had any more experiences, and it's been 3 years. I may never know what really was happening to me, but I know what I believe. It's hard to put into words exactly what happened to me that day in the park. I wouldn't say that I was abducted by aliens specifically, but I was definitely taken somewhere. It was more of an abduction of consciousness, if that makes sense. Maybe it was my body too. It's a strange, almost indescribable feeling, like being pulled out of reality. But let me start from the beginning. It was an ordinary afternoon in our small Midwestern town. My friends and I had decided to hang out at the local park. It was a sunny day, one of those perfect days where the sky is a brilliant blue and the air is crisp and clean. The park was empty except for us, which wasn't unusual given the size of our community. We were sitting on the grass, talking and smoking, enjoying each other's company. There were 5 of us. Sarah, who was always the life of the party with her infectious laugh. Mike, the quiet one with a thoughtful demeanor. Jesse, who never seemed to run out of stories to tell. Tim, the joker who could lighten any mood. And me, the observer who loved soaking in the details of moments like these. We were a tight-knit group, having grown up together in this sleepy town. We were in the middle of a lively discussion, the kind where everyone is talking over each other, when suddenly everything changed. It felt like someone had pressed a slow-motion button on our reality. The laughter and chatter around me began to fade, and my friends' movements became sluggish. Then, as if by some unseen force, everything came to a complete stop. I couldn't move or talk. I couldn't even blink. I was frozen in place. Panic set in as I realized I had to focus all my energy just to breathe. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, but before I could process it, everything went black. When I woke up, I found myself in a dark, almost pitch-black room. The silence was deafening, and I was alone. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed 3 large illuminated screens around me. On the screens, I saw the park from above, the exact spot where my friends and I had been sitting. It was a surreal, out-of-body experience. I could see us, frozen in time, captured from different angles. I sat there in that dark room, staring at the screens, feeling a mix of fear and confusion. It felt like I was there for hours, though it was impossible to tell time in that place. I kept wondering where I was and how I had gotten there. The sense of isolation was overwhelming. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, I blacked out again. When I came to, I was back in the park, lying on the ground. My cheeks were wet, and I realized I had been crying hysterically. Around me, my friends were in various states of distress. They looked as if they had just woken up from a nightmare, disoriented and scared. The air was thick with an unspoken fear, a shared trauma that none of us could articulate. I was the first to break the silence. "I think I met God," I blurted out, my voice shaking. It was a strange thing to say, and I didn't fully understand why those words came out. But they seemed to resonate with my friends. They each responded with similar brief statements, expressions of awe and terror. "I feel like we're on TV somewhere," Jessie whispered, her eyes wide with fear. It was a chilling thought, one that perfectly captured the feeling of being watched, of being violated in some deep, unsettling way. We didn't say much else. It was as if we were all under some kind of spell, unable to speak freely about what had happened. The strangest part for me was the unspoken agreement to leave it at that. We understood that we had all seen and experienced the same thing, but it felt dangerous to talk about it, like whatever or whoever had taken us could still hear us. We left the park immediately, each of us retreating to the safety of our own homes. I don't keep in touch with those friends anymore, but I often wonder if they felt the same way I did, that we had been abducted, in some sense, and that talking about it might somehow summon it back into our lives. For days after, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was some sort of mass hallucination, a shared delusion brought on by the weed we had been smoking. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The clarity of the experience, the vividness of the details, and the physical and emotional aftermath were too real to dismiss. The incident left me with a lingering sense of unease. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, constantly looking over my shoulder, feeling watched even in the comfort of my own home. I had trouble sleeping, plagued by dreams of the dark room and the illuminated screens. The sense of helplessness I felt in that place haunted me. Over time, I've tried to make sense of it. I've read about other abduction experiences, about people who have been taken by entities they can't explain. Their stories are eerily similar. Feelings of paralysis, time loss, and being watched. It's both comforting and terrifying to know that I'm not alone in this experience. My name is Tristan, and for as long as I can remember, I've been fascinated by the paranormal, especially UFOs. I've spent countless nights staring up at the sky, hoping for a glimpse of something otherworldly. For years, my desire for a personal UFO encounter seemed like a distant dream, one that might never come true. But all that changed about 6 years ago, sometime in 2013. We had just moved into a new house, only about 5 minutes away from our old one. My daily routine was fairly straightforward. Go to work from 9 to 5, come home, eat dinner, and then head over to the old house to work on getting it ready to sell. It was a busy time, and most nights, I found myself exhausted by the time I returned home. One night, after an exceptionally long and rough evening working on the old house, I was driving home when I noticed something unusual in the sky. It was around 1 a.m., and the neighborhood was quiet and dark. At first, I thought my tired eyes were playing tricks on me, but the object I saw was definitely not a common sight. Hovering silently above the trees was a large, glowing oval. It was wider than it was tall, and it seemed to emit a light without actually glowing, if that makes any sense. The light it gave off was dull, almost eerie, and yet it illuminated the object perfectly. I stopped my car and stared, my heart racing. This was it. The moment I had been waiting for my entire life was happening right before my eyes. Despite my exhaustion, I couldn't tear myself away from the sight. The object was completely still, defying any explanation I could muster. It wasn't a hot air balloon or a helicopter. It was something entirely different. I knew I needed to get home and share this experience with someone, anyone, who would believe me. I drove the short distance to my house, my mind racing with a mix of excitement and fear. As soon as I pulled into the driveway, I ran inside and woke up my daughter and son. It was a school night, and they were sound asleep, but I didn't care. They needed to see this. At first, they were groggy and confused, but when we stepped outside and they saw the object, their reactions mirrored my own. My daughter's eyes widened in shock, and my son, who was always the skeptic, stood frozen, unable to look away. Even at the age of 12, he knew this was something extraordinary. We stood there, the three of us, staring up at the sky. The object hadn't moved, and it remained as mesmerizing as ever. My daughter whispered, "Dad, what is that?" "I don't know," I replied, my voice shaky, "but it's real." We watched in silence, a mix of awe and fear washing over us. It was beautiful in a way, but it also gave off a feeling of dread, like we were witnessing something we weren't meant to see. The longer we looked, the more unsettling it became. I remembered that we had a pair of binoculars in one of the moving boxes. I rushed inside to get them, my hands trembling with excitement. When I returned, I handed them to my daughter first. She looked through them and gasped. "It looks old," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like it's made of metal with rivets and seams. But the top part is different, more modern." I took the binoculars from her and looked for myself. She was right. The bottom of the craft looked like it was made from old, weathered metal, reminiscent of the hull of an ancient ship. The top part, however, was sleek and smooth, almost futuristic. It had what looked like headlights on the back, similar to an old car. The top also had a shape that reminded me of a genie's lamp. As I continued to study the craft, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. It appeared to be sitting on a long, thin pedestal of yellowish light. I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. I handed the binoculars back to my daughter and asked her to describe what she saw. "There's a beam of light coming from underneath it," she said, her voice quivering with fear. "I'm scared, Dad. I think we should go inside." We couldn't shake the feeling of dread that enveloped us. It was as if we were intruding on something we had no right to see. Reluctantly, we went back inside, but we couldn't stop thinking about the craft. Our bedroom windows faced the direction of the sighting, and I found out later that my daughter stayed up all night, video chatting with her friends, too terrified to sleep. After showering, I lay in bed, exhausted but unable to stop thinking about what we had seen. I glanced out the window and noticed that the craft was moving, but at an incredibly slow rate. It was almost imperceptible, but by comparing it to the stationary frame of my window, I could see it gradually drifting away. The pale yellow light it emitted was unlike anything I had ever seen. It wasn't blinding, but it had a dull, eerie quality that added to the surreal nature of the experience. If you held out your arm, the craft was just slightly larger than the width of your thumb, which I later learned was quite large for a UFO sighting. Eventually, the craft disappeared from view, and I finally succumbed to exhaustion. As a welder, I knew I would pay the price for being up all night, but it was worth it. The next morning, I called MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, to report what we had seen. To my surprise, they took my story very seriously, and a field investigator was at my door within 24 hours. The MUFON rep was extremely thorough, explaining what natural phenomena could have caused what we saw. But it was a clear night with no moon, just stars. There was no logical explanation for what we had witnessed. I had managed to take a few pictures with my flip phone, but they were too grainy and dark to be of any real use. Despite the lack of concrete evidence, the experience left a lasting impression on me. For years, I had wanted to see a UFO, and now that it had happened, I felt a mix of exhilaration and fear. It wasn't just the sight of the craft itself, but the feeling that came with it. A sense of being watched, of encountering something beyond our understanding. My junior year in college was one of those years that feels both like a lifetime ago and just yesterday. It was packed with the usual chaos of academic pressures, social dramas, and the bittersweet taste of looming adulthood. But amidst the typical collegiate whirlwind, something happened that year that has lingered in my mind like an unsolved mystery. It's something I've never fully understood, or even been able to talk about without feeling a bit unhinged. Let me set the scene. My dorm room was connected to my roommate's room in such a way that I had to pass through her room to get to the bathroom or the hallway. Her name was Emily, and she was a light sleeper, though my predictable routine usually didn't bother her. I wasn't the type to stay out late, preferring the comfort of my bed and a good book or movie over late-night escapades. Now, I had two normal operations in my life up to that point, and both times I discovered that anesthesia affected me oddly. I would wake up briefly toward the end, right before I was supposed to. I guess I just wasn't a fast healer. Even a simple mosquito bite would linger for a month. Maybe that's why what happened next has stuck with me so vividly. One night, I had the most intense and vivid dream of my life. It was so real that I can still remember every detail like it happened yesterday. In this dream, I woke up somewhere else entirely. The experience was so fleeting, just a moment really, but it felt as if I were wide awake in that brief span. I looked left, then right, taking in my surroundings before passing out again, just like I had during my surgeries. I was lying on a hospital gurney, slightly inclined and facing a wall. The ambient noise behind me echoed through what seemed to be a vast room. The sounds weren't menacing, just the low hum of machines and the faint chatter of people. On either side of me were rows of empty hospital gurneys. At my feet, just to my right, were two figures having an animated conversation. One was a person in a dark suit, and the other was something else entirely. It was small, and its hands, which were visible from where I lay, had darker, almost grayish skin. They were speaking together so enthusiastically, like old friends catching up after years apart, completely unaware of my brief awakening. The language they spoke was unfamiliar to me. I couldn't place it. It wasn't German, Mandarin, or Russian, languages I could at least recognize if I heard them. This was something wholly unrecognizable, yet the person in the suit was fluent. When I woke up for real, I told myself it was just a messed up dream and tried to shake it off. I went about my morning routine, which included a quick shower. As I passed Emily, who was still in bed, she groggily asked, "Where did you go last night?" Her question caught me off guard. I hadn't gone anywhere, had I? After my shower, I started putting on my makeup and noticed something unusual on my face. Leaning closer to the mirror, I saw two perfectly parallel lines, thin and precise, with some clear, hard gel on top. There was no blood, and the cuts were so thin that even my own hair seemed thicker in comparison. This was 1996, and I had never seen anything like it. Today, I might describe it as a laser cut topped with liquid bandage, but those things weren't common back then. I immediately searched my bed for anything that could have caused the cuts. Staples, paper clips, anything sharp that I might have rolled onto in my sleep. But I found nothing. In a fit of curiosity, I tried replicating the cuts with a sewing needle, a staple, and a paperclip. I dunked them in hydrogen peroxide and made small incisions on my face, but each one drew blood immediately and the skin was jagged, unlike the smooth, perfect lines I had found that morning. I skipped my first class that day, sitting on the edge of my bed, obsessively feeling my face and trying to figure out what had happened. The precision of the cuts and their mysterious appearance baffled me. The idea of asking someone for help crossed my mind, but in 1996, talking about aliens or strange occurrences made you a social pariah. I debated with myself for hours, finally deciding to just go about my day. By the time evening rolled around, I was exhausted from the mental strain. I went to bed, hoping to forget the whole thing. When I woke up in the early hours of the morning, the cuts were completely gone. No scars, no trace of them ever being there. It was as if my face had healed overnight, something that, given my usual slow healing process, was utterly impossible. For a few days, I was deeply disturbed, but as time went on, I pushed the memory to the back of my mind. Life went on, and so did I, finishing college and moving on to other adventures. Years later, after graduating and settling into a routine, I decided to get some dental work done. I visited 2 different offices to get quotes, and both took full facial x-rays. By then, I had almost forgotten about that crazy dream and the mysterious cuts. But when I sat down with the first x-ray technician, something caught my eye. There was a strange, almost square shape above my teeth on the x-ray. I pointed to the image and asked if it was a mirror reflection, but the technician assured me it was an actual x-ray, not mirrored. The square shape was on the right side of my face, the same side as the cuts had been years before. I was told it was just an x-ray anomaly, nothing to worry about. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. When I visited the second dentist, an orthodontist, the same square appeared on the x-ray in the exact same place. This time, I didn't bother with small talk. I pointed directly at the square and asked what it was. The technician looked at me strangely before leaning in and whispering, "We see them all the time." Her words sent chills down my spine. This was in Spokane, Washington, and the thought that both sets of x-ray plates could be damaged in the same exact spot seemed too coincidental. I didn't know much about x-rays, but it seemed unlikely. Reflecting on my situation, I couldn't help but think there might be something in my face, something put there by someone or something else. Here's what I know. Humans often tag animals for research, using tranquilizers and invasive procedures with little regard for the animal's well-being. If what happened to me was a similar kind of tagging, it was done with far more care than we usually show other species. I never felt pain, and my cuts healed instantly. If it was a research-driven tag, it was done with an almost considerate touch. I've often wondered what would happen if I got another x-ray today, 20 years later. I try to look at the images from airport security, but I never see anything unusual. Surprisingly, I've come to terms with it. I think it might just be science, nothing malevolent. I wish I could have given my consent, but I suppose it's hard to ask for consent when you're not even supposed to exist. Thinking back to that vivid dream, the strange cuts, and the square in my x-rays, I can't help but feel a sense of wonder mixed with a bit of fear. What happened to me that year in college? Was it all just an elaborate dream, a product of my stressed-out mind? Or was it something more, something I'll never fully understand? One thing's for sure, that year changed me. It opened my mind to the possibilities of the unknown and made me more aware of the mysteries that surround us every day. I've learned to live with the uncertainty, to embrace the questions without always needing answers. My father would tell me this story with such a straight face that I never knew whether to believe him or not. It always had a way of sending chills down my spine, even though he recounted it so matter-of-factly. I often wondered if it was just one of those family myths that got passed down through the generations. But when I asked my grandmother about it, she confirmed every detail, saying she remembered it as clearly as if it happened yesterday. Back then, my grandmother was known simply as Mother to her 3 children, one of whom would become my father. They lived out in the middle of nowhere in rural Michigan, surrounded by trees and tranquility. It was a place so secluded that the hustle and bustle of the world seemed like a distant dream. My grandfather was taking the kids to stay with relatives for the weekend, giving my grandparents a rare and much-needed break. When my grandfather returned home that evening, the house was enveloped in a darkness that felt almost tangible, the kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. Despite the eerie atmosphere, my grandparents had a fine evening. They talked, laughed, and enjoyed the quiet that was so rare in a household with 3 young children. Eventually, they drifted off to sleep without any trouble. They didn't have any trouble waking up either, as they were abruptly awakened by bright flashes of light piercing through the tiny window in their bedroom. The intensity and the suddenness of the light immediately jolted them out of their slumber. My grandmother, startled and concerned, looked at my grandfather who, trying to be brave, decided to investigate. They quickly made their way to the kitchen, where the source of the light seemed to be coming from. My grandfather, telling my grandmother to stay back, cautiously opened the back door. What they saw defied all logic and understanding. There, floating just above the ground in a neat circular formation, was an array of brightly colored lights, flashing in an almost hypnotic rhythm. As their eyes adjusted to the unearthly brightness, they realized the lights were emanating from some sort of craft, almost shaped like a football but slightly more rounded. The craft was large enough to fit a family inside, but small enough to nestle between the patches of trees that surrounded their home. The material of the craft was indiscernible due to the overwhelming brightness of the lights. My grandfather, squinting and trying to make sense of the scene, suddenly noticed movement. A figure was walking towards them, humanoid in shape but distinctly not human. The creature walked on 2 legs and had a body shape similar to a human's, but its head was elongated and bulbous, giving it an alien appearance. It appeared to be nude, yet there were no visible genitalia. It raised a hand in what seemed to be a wave, but the hand stayed still, almost as if it was waiting for a high five. My grandfather stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do. My grandmother, who had by then joined him outside, was equally stunned. Seeing the look on her face, my grandfather realized they weren't dreaming. This was happening. Another figure emerged from the craft, walking on a platform that protruded from its side. This second creature was holding a flat, round object. The first creature took it and offered it to my grandparents. Hesitantly, my grandfather reached out to take it, but the creature pulled back and extended it towards my grandmother instead. She glanced at my grandfather, unsure if she should accept the strange gift. After a moment's hesitation, she took it. The object felt squishy and round, like a large pancake. The creature then produced another similar object and began to eat it, clearly waiting for my grandparents to do the same. Without thinking, they each tore a piece from the pancake and ate it. The texture was different, and the taste was unfamiliar, yet not unpleasant. It seemed to be made from some type of grain, but not one they recognized. After seeing my grandparents eat, the creatures made another still wave, retreated into their craft, and the platform retracted. The flashing lights began to fade, and within moments, the craft was gone, disappearing into the night sky. The next morning, my grandparents were left with the memory of their bizarre encounter and the remnants of the pancake-like substance. They were bewildered and unsure of what to do. When my father asked years later what they did with the pancake, whether they gave it to the government or reported the incident, both my grandparents said it would have been impossible to report something like that without being thought of as crazy. In those days, mentioning aliens or UFOs would have made them social pariahs. As I grew older, I often revisited this story in my mind. It seemed too strange to be true, yet my grandmother's clear recollection and my father's unwavering retelling always left me wondering. The details were too vivid, too specific to be purely fictional. My grandmother's description of the light, the craft, and the creatures were always the same, no matter how many times she told the story. I remember one particularly cold winter when I was visiting my grandparents in Michigan. The nights were long and the sky was a tapestry of stars, more numerous and brilliant than anything I could see back home in the city. We were sitting by the fireplace, the room filled with the comforting crackle of burning logs and the scent of pine. "Tell me about the night you saw the lights," I asked my grandmother. She looked at me, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames, and sighed. "It was the strangest night of my life," she began. "Your grandfather and I had just settled in for a quiet evening. The house was so quiet without you kids. We were enjoying the peace when those lights woke us up. At first, I thought it was a storm, but the flashes were too bright, too rhythmic." She paused, as if trying to find the right words. "When we opened the door and saw that craft, I've never seen anything like it. The colors were so bright, it hurt to look at them. And those creatures, they were like us, but not. It was almost like looking at a reflection in a funhouse mirror." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The pancake they gave us, it tasted so strange. Not bad, just different. I often wonder what it was made of. Sometimes I think about that night and wonder if they were trying to tell us something, or if they were just as curious about us as we were about them." I listened, hanging on her every word, the crackling fire and the howling wind outside adding to the sense of mystery. I could almost see the scene unfold in my mind. The dark, quiet house, the sudden burst of light, the strange visitors offering their alien food. Years later, after my grandparents had passed away, I found myself back in that old farmhouse, now belonging to my father. I was cleaning out the attic when I came across an old, dusty box. Inside were photographs, letters, and a small, sealed jar. Curiosity piqued. I opened the jar and found a piece of something that looked like a dried pancake. Could it be the same one from that night? I held the jar up to the light, turning it over in my hands. The object inside was strange, almost otherworldly. I wondered if this was the last remnant of my grandparents' encounter with the unknown. It felt like a tangible piece of a mystery that had always seemed just out of reach. The farmhouse, with its creaking floors and drafty windows, held so many memories. I spent the next few days sifting through the remnants of my family's past, finding small treasures and forgotten mementos. Each item told a story, but none as strange or compelling as the one about the lights and the visitors. I've always wanted to share this story, even though it brings fear into my heart every time I think about it. It happened in northern Arizona, a place where the dense forests and pitch-black woods can make you feel like you're a million miles away from civilization. I was with 6 other people, and we were on our way to go snowboarding. It was around 11 p.m., and the darkness of the forest seemed almost tangible, like a thick blanket smothering the world. We were driving in a convoy of 2 cars, with ours trailing behind the lead car. I remember feeling a sense of camaraderie and excitement as we joked and chatted about the adventures awaiting us on the slopes. The air was filled with laughter and the hum of the car engines. However, as we ventured deeper into the forest, a sense of unease began to creep over me. The tall, looming trees seemed to close in on us, and the inky blackness outside the windows felt almost suffocating. Suddenly, the car in front of us slammed on its brakes. Our driver gasped in horror, instantly catching everyone's attention. "Do you see it? Do you see it?" They kept saying, their voices tinged with panic and disbelief. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to see what had caused such a reaction. Ahead of us, just beyond the tree line, a massive spacecraft was descending. It was a huge, disc-like object with a swell of multicolored lights emanating from its engines, bending the trees beneath its enormous weight. The sight was so surreal, so otherworldly, that it felt like a scene straight out of a science fiction movie. But this was no movie. It was happening right in front of our eyes. The spacecraft was unlike anything I had ever seen. It hovered silently, its surface smooth and reflective, almost as if it were made of liquid metal. The lights on its underside shifted and pulsed, casting an eerie glow that danced across the treetops. I was mesmerized, unable to tear my eyes away from the incredible sight. For what felt like an eternity, we all stared in stunned silence. The only sounds were our own breaths, quick and shallow, and the occasional rustle of the trees in the night breeze. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the spacecraft warped and disappeared into the sky, leaving us with a profound sense of dread and wonder. It moved with a speed and grace that seemed impossible, vanishing without a trace. We drove for 3 hours in complete silence, each of us lost in our thoughts, trying to process what we had just witnessed. The atmosphere in the car was thick with tension and disbelief. I could see the wide-eyed expressions of my friends in the dim light, their faces pale and drawn. Every so often, someone would start to say something, only to fall silent again, unable to find the words. When we finally reached our destination, an old wood cabin in Pinetop, everyone was exhausted. One by one, they fell asleep, but I couldn't shake the deep fear that had taken root in my heart. I lay down, hoping that sleep would come and bring some semblance of peace, but it was elusive. The events of the night replayed in my mind, over and over, like a broken record. It was the 9th of August, a night filled with the sounds of laughter, the scent of barbecues, and the brilliant flashes of fireworks painting the sky in bursts of red, white, and blue. My name is Trey, and what happened to my best friend Patrick that night is something I still struggle to wrap my head around. This isn't just a story about fireworks and fun. It's a tale that has left me with more questions than answers. Patrick and I, along with a group of our closest friends, had gathered at a large open field on the outskirts of our town. We were armed with an impressive arsenal of fireworks, ready to light up the night sky and celebrate our independence in the most traditional way possible. The atmosphere was electric, filled with the crackle and pop of firecrackers and the high-pitched whistling of rockets shooting skyward. As the grand finale of our firework display approached, we decided to engage in what had become our own little tradition, a bottle rocket fight. Armed with makeshift launchers, we darted around the field, laughing and dodging the small projectiles. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of gunpowder. By the time we exhausted our supply, we were breathless, sweaty, and exhilarated. I was convinced I'd won the battle, though Patrick would probably tell you otherwise. It was late, well past midnight, and the only light came from the residual glow of the fireworks and the distant streetlights. Our friends began to disperse, each heading home with tales of the night to share. Patrick and I called his mom to pick us up. She agreed to meet us at the high school, which was about a 10-minute walk from the field. As we started our trek, the night seemed to close in around us. The excitement of the evening still buzzed in the air, but a quiet, almost eerie calm had settled over the neighborhood. We walked in companionable silence, the only sound being our footsteps on the pavement. Suddenly, something caught my eye, a strange, glowing shape hovering over the tree line. "Hey, Patrick, do you see that?" I pointed towards the trees. Patrick squinted into the darkness. "Yeah, what is that? Maybe a spotlight from the river barges?" But it wasn't moving like a spotlight. It just hovered there, eerily still. Our curiosity piqued. We veered off our path and headed towards the light. As we got closer, the glow intensified, bathing the trees in an otherworldly luminescence. My heart began to race, not with fear, but with a strange sense of anticipation. Then, as if someone had flipped a switch, the light exploded into a brilliant, blinding glare that hit us square in the face. Instinctively, we turned and ran, our previous bravado forgotten. We sprinted towards the high school, not daring to look back. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but adrenaline pushed me forward. When we finally reached the school, I was out of breath, but relieved to see Patrick's mom waiting for us in her car. I collapsed into the back seat, trying to catch my breath. It wasn't until Patrick's mom asked where Patrick was that I realized he wasn't behind me anymore. Panic set in. I fumbled for my phone, trying to call him, but there was no answer. His mom's face went pale, and without a word, she started driving around the area, both of us calling out for Patrick, our voices echoing in the still night. After what felt like an eternity, she remembered the tracking app on her phone. With shaking hands, she pulled it up. Relief washed over us when the app showed Patrick's phone at his house. Confused but hopeful, we drove straight there. The house was dark except for a dim light in Patrick's bedroom window. We rushed inside, calling his name. There he was, sound asleep in his bed, looking for all the world like he hadn't just been part of one of the most terrifying nights of my life. His mom shook him awake, anger and relief warring on her face. Patrick sat up, groggy and disoriented. "What happened?" he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "You tell us," his mom snapped. "We were looking everywhere for you." Patrick looked genuinely confused. "Last thing I remember is watching fireworks with you guys." I felt a chill run down my spine. How could he not remember? We were together, running for our lives. And now he was here, safe in his bed, with no recollection of the events. Over the next few days, we tried to piece together what happened. Patrick couldn't explain how he got home, or why he had no memory of the strange light. It was as if his mind had just blocked it out. The whole experience left me with an uneasy feeling that I couldn't shake. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. What was that light? How did Patrick end up back in his bed? It's a mystery that remains unsolved, a strange and terrifying event that has left a lasting impression on both of us. And every 9th of August, as the fireworks light up the sky, I can't help but look over my shoulder, wondering if the light will return.